you. And thank you so much. My name is Aisha Blake, and as you just heard, I am Director of Developer Relations at Pluralsight. That's very new, and it's really exciting for me because it represents a return to focusing squarely on technical education. That's really where my career started. My first job involved teaching and writing curricula for a coding boot camp. In the second company I worked for, I was a developer, and they had an incredible apprenticeship program. And so from the very beginning of my career, this idea of nurturing people into fantastic developers has been front and center. If you're not currently supporting junior developers, I hope that this talk will help you get really honest about why that is. I say that because in writing this talk, I've been struck time and time again about how much advice on how to support juniors sounds like advice on how to support healthy teams. For me, it comes down to good stewardship. You can think of a team like a garden. Each person or plant on a team has their own preferences, their own needs, their own potential. You have to prepare the way, pay attention as things change, and provide individualized support. If you can balance all of that, you vastly improve your chances of producing impactful work consistently and sustainably over time. If you're listening to me talk about this, I hope I don't have to convince you that integrating junior developers into your team is valuable. That being said, as a champion of early career developers in your organization, you're probably going to need to articulate that value. I offer a few suggestions here to use as a starting point, but the more that you can tie your case to the specific goals and challenges that you're already facing, the more effective it'll be. Maybe most obviously, the senior developers that you now have on your team will leave. Even your happiest, most productive developers will eventually move on for one reason or another, either by changing roles or exiting the company entirely. It's often less expensive and less disruptive to promote someone than to hire a brand new senior team member. I would like to advocate for giving yourself the flexibility to do both. Generally speaking, the deeper we get into our respective areas of expertise, the more we're affected by the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge is a cognitive bias, and that makes it really difficult to recall what it felt like to learn something. When you can draw from a vast store of knowledge, it's easy to make assumptions about what other people already know. And at best, this is going to result in some very awkward conversations. More likely, you'll end up with underdocumented and opaque systems. New team members, especially those early in their career, can mitigate that bias with questions and fresh sets of eyes. They'll often force you to question the why of things, even if they don't ask directly. And the last case I'll make here is that having a mix of work that doesn't correspond to your level is frustrating. Imagine an engineering team made up entirely of senior engineers. Of course, none of you are on teams like that, I'm sure. Let's say that they break work down into stories and they ship quickly, but the most complex and interesting work isn't divided equally. Again, I'm sure none of you work on teams like that. One or two engineers end up churning through tasks that don't require a ton of domain knowledge, they don't afford them opportunities to advance, and ultimately don't challenge them. Not only could that work be handled by someone at a lower level and a lower salary, but there are probably at least a couple of folks on this team who feel stuck. In distributing challenge on building highly engaged teams, Kurt Kempel lays out this problem pretty nicely. He proposes that we should use a pyramid of challenge to visualize our work. The pyramid of challenge illustrates that work in terms of availability and complexity. Each layer roughly represents a level, junior, mid, and senior in this case. And your pyramid is going to depend on your team. You could have 4 or 5 levels. Now, think back to the team that I described earlier. Everybody's up at the top of the pyramid, but that isn't necessarily reflected in the work that they're doing. Maybe there is enough challenging work for all of those seniors, but the less challenging or less urgent work is continuously deprioritized. Either way, this team is experiencing a challenge gap and is at risk for high turnover. Ideally, you want to strive for balance, filling in the gaps wherever they exist on your team. In my experience, that gap is most often at the bottom of the pyramid. When challenge is well distributed and we're intentional about identifying challenge gaps, it becomes easier to scale teams. As a side note, I'm a firm believer in the idea that everybody sweeps. It's a rule that comes from my days as a theater kid. In a community theater, it doesn't matter what your role is when it's time to clean up. Everybody sweeps. In the same way, I don't mean to imply that any of us are above any particular task. Rather, that we should be distributing the available tasks such that there's a balanced distribution of challenge whenever possible. In order to do that, we need to build teams to include a range of levels. Another great rule to live by: set clear expectations. We're going to apply this in 3 different ways: documenting team processes, developing a career ladder, and writing job descriptions. If you don't already have robust onboarding documentation, create it. Again, this isn't just for early developers. It's another investment in your team's sustainability. Walk through the experience of getting set up as a new developer on the team and create a friction log for each required task. What questions did you have? What was frustrating or unclear? Write down exactly what you did and any reactions that you had. To the extent that you can, try to ignore your knowledge of your team's processes. Remember that the curse of knowledge applies not only to your code, but to your team's processes and norms as well. If you do have newer team members, look to them for their relatively recent experience in ramping up. The form that your team's documentation takes and the tools that you use will depend on a number of factors. So again, I will provide some suggestions. Make sure that absolutely everything is written down. This is first and foremost an issue of accessibility, but it will also make it easier to search and maintain your documentation, regardless of the platform you use. Build in video, activities, meetings, even. But start by writing down everything that new folks need to know. Outline a clear path. Organize that writing so that there's no question as to how to get started or where to go with the most common types of questions. Finally, prefer plain language whenever possible. Avoid idioms and jargon. Make an effort to explain any commonly used abbreviations. And this extends well beyond onboarding and into the everyday life of your team. What expectations does your team have around commit messages, PR titles, component documentation? Why do you have the meetings that you do have? Is there a history of those meetings or some kind of decision log? What's your team's purpose? How do you tend to interact with other teams? More immediately, how should a new team member interact with their teammates? Anytime I join a new team, I request that my teammates create a personal user manual. This is a document that outlines who you are at work. They can and should contain as much information as you and your team is interested in sharing, but the prompts that I find most useful are around values, communication, preferences, and growth. My friend Megan Sullivan published a really wonderful version of this on her website, and I would highly recommend taking a look at that as one example of what a personal user manual can look like and adapting it to work for your team. Just as you've set clear expectations around how your team operates, so should you get abundantly clear about what you expect from your junior engineers. How can you know whether or not your junior is successful if you haven't defined what that success looks like? They certainly won't know unless you put it into words. This starts with understanding what a junior developer even is in the context of your team. One of my past teams had a pretty wide range of levels among the engineers, from junior all the way up to principal engineer. We had a loose description of how much direction each level would need in order to complete their work, but in practice, that meant that there wasn't a ton of clarity around what type of work each person was expected to do. We ended up with junior engineers picking up the same kinds of tasks as senior engineers, and going back to our pyramid of challenge, we do want everyone to stretch themselves and take on tasks that push them out of their comfort zone. But we need to be able to identify when people are pushing past that comfort zone, when they're exceeding the expectations of their role, and when they might be ready for advancement. Without some form of a career ladder, it's much more difficult to have conversations around the quality of someone's work or career progression. An already subjective process is left entirely up for interpretation. While I don't know of a truly objective way to measure and track job performance, a truly objective way, clarifying expectations around the knowledge, the tasks, and the impact people at each level should have is a huge step in the right direction. When you can, go back and watch Marco Rogers' LeadDev talk on creating a career ladder for engineers. He shares a ton of insights and resources that I found really useful. One takeaway that I'll share, little spoiler, is that Marco suggests that the senior level is your anchor. Chances are you have opinions about what makes someone senior or not. Write that down. Now you have a reference point to build from. Congratulations. And here we are again, engaged in something that will benefit not just juniors, but the entire team. A well-written career ladder provides clarity at every level. It offers a basis for discussions in one-on-ones throughout the year so that performance reviews are less likely to contain surprises. You can even share your ladder externally to give prospective candidates a better idea of what standards they're going to be held to. The bulk of a junior developer's work should be learning, completing clearly defined technical tasks, and communicating when they run into issues or questions. That's basically it. Keep that in mind when you go to write the job description. There's a tendency in tech to list everything but the kitchen sink in job descriptions. Even for junior roles. Why did we do this? Well, a more senior engineer is likely to know when job criteria are unreasonable. Someone searching for their first role in tech might not know that difference. If you're a hiring manager, take an active role in communicating what your team actually needs. If you're really interested in people with a particular skill, but it's really a nice to have, list it as a nice to have. This will probably also help increase the diversity of your applicant pool. Certain demographics, including women as a whole, tend not to apply if they don't fit the vast majority of job criteria. Once you've got a draft, workshop it. Share it with a trusted, diverse group of people familiar with your team and ask for feedback. Look at the language that you're using. Does it accurately communicate the culture of your company and your team? What if you're hiring several people at once? If you're open to hiring juniors at all, consider pulling that junior role out into its own rec. More often than not, I've seen companies open up roles that ostensibly could go to junior devs, and more experienced folks end up actually getting hired. As with everything in this process, be intentional about who and how you're hiring. This is very literally an investment of time and of money. Keep in mind that that new developer isn't doing all of this in a bubble. One of your goals is to integrate them into the team as soon as possible. So consider developing a pairing schedule and help them to get familiar with different parts of the code base as well as different teammates. I found that it works best to have a designated coach when training a junior developer. I'm avoiding the word mentor here, because that tends to be where we default. And that's only one part of the puzzle. A mentorship is largely driven by the mentee. They choose their own focus areas. They determine the agenda. They make their own goals, and then come to a mentor with questions and some idea of what they want to do with the knowledge that they gain. In return, a mentor offers their advice based on their own experiences. A mentor can be a great person to ask questions of, bounce ideas off of, glean wisdom from. But they don't even necessarily need to have a direct relationship in order to share some of those benefits. A coach is a guide on the side. They lead with curiosity. They ask questions designed to help the one they're coaching work through challenges. Those questions should be open-ended. What is this line of code doing? Why do you think we're using that pattern here? What could you refactor so that that function is more performant? Who can you reach out to get information that you need about this project? Training implies that there's some structure, some framework, some discipline involved. Coaching a junior developer requires not only technical expertise, but excellent planning and communication skills. Depending on how your career ladder conversations went, playing this kind of role will hopefully help a more senior dev advance in their own career. Regardless, coaching is now part of their job. Explicitly, I will say it again, explicitly adjust any expectations you have around output for that person, for that coach. It's OK if you don't get it right the first time. Set aside time to reevaluate on a regular basis, because their output will change. Their focus is now partly on this new person, and that in and of itself is valuable. The first time I had the opportunity to support a junior engineer, she asked a ton of wonderful questions. Part of the expectation was that all the other devs on the team would pair with her in a version of the pairing schedule that I mentioned earlier. While she received positive feedback every week, it took us 3 months to realize that she hadn't had much of an opportunity to touch the code base. More experienced developers had basically demonstrated as they talked her through the problems that she was approaching, but she didn't get to have any ownership. She didn't get to work through those problems herself. Where initially I thought we were doing great in teaching her and guiding her, When I realized that, my heart sank. I felt like we'd let her down. It can be so tempting to take supporting someone new, especially if they're early in their career, too far. We can get comfortable with regarding them as junior without expecting them to know much or to have any agency over their journey. When we do, we're doing them a disservice, especially if we're not also challenging them to complete tasks of increasing complexity. We should aim to ensure that they see the bigger picture of tasks that you're trying to complete. We should choose tasks that will advance their understanding of the project as a whole, build on previous successes to help them accomplish more and more complex tasks, and give clear, direct feedback on how their actions measure up against the team's standards, which, of course, you've documented. Whether you're a coach, a buddy, a mentor, or a manager, try to maintain an open dialogue. This person should be an active participant in their own success, and that means allowing them the autonomy to say when something isn't working for them, or to ask for something that hasn't been offered yet. It means being open to feedback and to change. It also means that building trust has to be a priority from day one. In my experience, that begins with recognizing the power dynamics at play in any given relationship. What institutional power do you have over this new member of your team? What privileges does your identity afford you, particularly in comparison to them? Do you have the power to affect their employment? Regardless of whether you actually do, what is their perception of your power? Be mindful of the answers to these questions in every interaction that you have with this person. What feels like an offhand comment or a joke to you might be absolutely terrifying to them. Being willing to take the first step can help. Offer feedback on a regular cadence. If you can, make it part of every one-on-one you have. In that way, feedback becomes part of your relationship. When something bigger does come up, it's easier to have a productive conversation. When you have constructive feedback, make sure it's specific, actionable, and timely. Ask for feedback regularly. When you receive it, avoid acting defensively. Consider it. You may not be willing or able to make the change that's been suggested, but it's an opportunity to engage with the other person regardless. Admit when you don't know something. I'm not sure, but I'll find the answer for you. I'd recommend asking Adrian about that, and let's try it are all valid responses. Continue to stress that you know they'll need to ask questions. You can even put a metric on that last one. Determine the maximum amount of time a junior dev on your team should spend spinning their wheels on a given problem. You might know this as the 1-hour rule, but personally, I tend to make it more like 20, 30 minutes. The point is to determine a maximum amount of time after which they're expected to seek help from the rest of the team. Often, explaining the problem to someone will help them get unstuck. When I taught coding full-time, I often joked that I was really just a professional rubber duck. If you get past that rubber duck stage, the next question I like to ask is, what did you try? Answering this question may lead to a solution in the same way that explaining the original problem can, but it also underscores the expectation that they make some meaningful attempt before asking for help. Especially at the very beginning, there will be times when they don't know what they don't know, when they don't have the vocabulary to search for the answer they need. And in those times, use your best judgment. If you think it will be a useful learning exercise, ask them guiding questions to arrive at the answer they need. If not, It's okay to be more direct. It's exciting to watch and participate as someone makes discoveries early in their career. Most developer educators that I know talk about some version of the aha moment, the moment where something clicks and a learner gains a new understanding of a tool or a concept. I think it's important to share in that excitement as a team. Recognize when someone has made progress, especially if you're in the role of a coach. Make a habit of asking the person you're coaching to think about where they were at some previous point in time, to compare their knowledge and their confidence right now. The questions that they're asking right now to their knowledge, confidence, and questions a week ago, a month ago, maybe even a year ago, occasionally. In an interview that I did with Chelsea Troy, she made a really great analogy for learning to code. She described it in terms of strength training. At the beginning, you can make huge strides quickly as you level up from having no knowledge to having some. As time goes on, the incremental wins, unless you're tracking very, very carefully, are more difficult to see. Always being challenged, always striving to learn new skills or techniques means that we're never going to be perfect. And there are always going to be new things to learn, new skills to improve on. The work will always feel challenging. Again, assuming that we are distributing challenge effectively. But when you zoom out and you look at the difference in the complexity of the problems that are posing that challenge, you can see growth. So at this point, you've gotten buy-in by articulating the value of hiring junior developers. You have documented your team's processes to the best of your ability. You've gotten very clear about everyone's expectations. And you've begun to build a culture that prioritizes psychological safety and actionable feedback. What happens after that? How do you make sure that you're not just bringing this person in and not truly supporting them long term? First, it's a matter of following through on all the commitments that you've already made. That might mean that you need to tackle these things one at a time, building them into your daily operations to avoid introducing too much change all at once. In the same way that suddenly and drastically changing many parts of your personal life at once will probably end in disaster, adjusting all of these aspects of your team at the same time is likely to overburden that team. Take the practices that I've described here and try them out. Adjust as necessary, and if something's not working, drop it. It won't be perfect, but workshopping things like the way you give feedback and your career ladder before unleashing them on a junior developer is probably a good idea. As I said in the beginning, the vast majority of these things are helpful to teams in general. They're worth the investment, even if, at the end of the day, you decide you still aren't going to hire any more junior engineers. Talk to the senior members of your team about what it means to be a sponsor. This can be harder to practice because it involves a certain level of opportunism. When you're in rooms that an early career dev doesn't have access to yet, or otherwise in a position to share your influence, like being on a stage, that's an opportunity to advocate for that person. It can look like recommending them for a project, nominating them for an award, or even hyping them up on social media. This type of support can be a source for more challenging work, but it also serves to make your sponsees' work more visible. Thank you again for sharing this time with me. I'd love to know what's worked and what hasn't as you've endeavored to be a champion for junior developers. And so please reach out.